tonight's webinar, so it's this first module of 6, and it underlays everything that we are going to be building on based on the webinar that I sent you guys recently. And I know there's a couple of new people in here tonight that haven't seen that webinar, so I will send you that link. But for anyone watching this after the fact, there's a webinar called Defining Performance on the Principles of Performance channel. And I highly recommend sort of giving that a watch so that you can get a little bit more context out of, I guess, the things that we're going to be discussing here, and then the things that we're going to be discussing across the next 5 sort of modules. And these modules are going to be very fluid as well. So they're not specifically set in stone in terms of this is the only way to, you know, coach or treat. All I want to do is just change the way you think about things tonight, like stress and adaptation, and how we can use that in a clinical sense and also in a coaching sense. So let's crack in. Now, if this thing wants to let me do my thing, I'll be very happy. There we go. Okay, so for this webinar, I've got several outcomes. The first of which will be understanding the difference between stress and exposure as it pertains to our physiology. So this one will be crucial, specifically because there is a significant difference in the way that we look at the two. I'm just going to move myself around so I can be a little bit more comfortable. There we go. There is a significant difference in the way that we should look at the two, based on the principles of physiology and how organisms like us adapt to our environments. Then we're going to understand the principles of our stress molecule, which will be revealed later. But you know, across the next several minutes, have a little bit of a think and maybe even write it down and see if you can come up with what you think the stress molecule might be. You know, it might shock you. And then the last one, understand the ways we can manipulate the difference to enhance health, function, and capacity. So the difference between stress and exposure, and how we can manipulate the stress molecule to enhance health, function, and capacity performance. So let's crack in. So our first little chunk is defining adaptation, which is, you know, one of my favorite things to do. So adaptation is essentially just very, very rapid cellular problem solving. When you take a cell and expose it to its environment, it has 2 options. Its options are to survive, or its options are to die. And this happens all around us all the time in anything that has the ability to grow. So it doesn't happen in things that are inert like dirt or rock, but in things like leaves, animals like bugs, all the way down to ants, all the way up to bloody antelope or elephants, and humans especially. When we put them into an environment, they are exposed to stresses, and those stresses are asking the organism to constantly adapt to survive. By definition, the process or change by which an organism becomes better suited to an environment. So we've got this element of survival, and then an expanding concept of better suited. So we're actually not only surviving, but we're kind of thriving. And it's this mindset that we want to get in when we want to talk about the difference between stress and exposure. So the process, this is a process that's happening where our cells are constantly decaying and renewing. This process is called autophagy or autophagy, whatever you want to pronounce it as. And it's essentially the removal of old cells. So we take the old cells away to make room for the new cells, so that those new cells can thrive in their new environment. And this process is an aerobic process. So that means that it requires oxygen to fuel it, which will be an important feature for later. So we've got autophagy or autophagy, whatever you want to call it, and mitosis is the other end of that spectrum. So we've got a cell that's within its environment, and then it gets exposed to a stress and it is asked to adapt. And the adaptation phase of that, which we're about to expand upon, is known as mitosis. So we've got these 2 seemingly opposite principles or physiological functions, one of decay and one of renewal, but they work together, and they work in the presence of oxygen in order for those cellular processes to continue happening. Obviously, if we take the oxygen away, that process dies off. And if it dies off, then there can be no decay and there can be no renewal. So they each need each other in order to be a continual process, and they each continue that process until the organism can no longer withstand the stress of that environment, and then it dies. So it's quite a natural occurrence. In Buddhism, they call it anicca, which is the state of decay of everything. So everything is in a state of decay. Now, cells responding to an environmental change or stress in order to adapt is done via a process called mitosis, which we just talked about. So this process can be expedited, I beg your pardon, by taking our egos out of it and making it as objective as possible. So you guys, the ones that specifically in this mentorship watching this video, you will specifically know that I like to make sure everything's measured. I try to take my ego out of it as much as I can when it comes to what I do, because I don't want my opinion to get in the way of the process. Because if it does, then it gets in the way of the outcome, and I can start to bias the outcome. So I try my best not to bias those outcomes. Now, in the sense of this decay and renewal, when we are taking our ego out of the process, we actually become a little bit more in tune with this process of decay and renewal, or as the Buddhists will call it, anicca. And I brought up anicca only because it was just like in my mind right now. But anicca in Buddhism is about removing your ego from the process of decay and renewal and just experiencing it. When we hurt ourselves and we go through this recovery phase, or we might have surgery, we have a rehab phase, it's very easy to get ourselves sort of hung up on the past and what we were capable of doing, and it can affect what we are capable of doing now. And if it affects our now, it can affect the steps we need to put in place in order to get to where we need to be. And it's where we need to be and further, that is the state of renewal that we need to find ourselves in. So in a way, the old us needs to die off and decay in order for the new us to be reforged or rehabilitated into this new environment where the stress of having that injury or that regrowing tissue is no longer holding us back, but we're now progressing and thriving. And this is an important step that we need to be explaining to clients, that they're constantly going through this cycle of adaptation. And if they aren't, then they're stagnating. And if they do, that can lend itself to some psychological effects, of course, but also some cellular problems down the track that will affect their performance. So let's have a quick look at mitosis in action. So we have the environment, and within it, a little blue cell. And that blue cell is just sitting there and having a great old time. And it's being exposed to a stressor. So a stressor comes along and it imposes itself on this environment and on this cell, and the cell will start to vibrate. And in a very brief crash course of cellular biology, it will start to vibrate so hard within this environment that it will shear and split. So it will be a parent cell that will become two identical sister cells. And these two identical sister cells are now more capable of withstanding the stress of the environment, which is very important to understand. One couldn't do it, so one became two. Then what will happen is a further stress will compound and create that same process again, where those two cells are now vibrating because of this pressure that they're under, and then they will both split and they will create another set of sister cells. So now where two couldn't withstand the environment, four can. And this will continue to happen. And as it does, the cells that multiply and divide become more complex. This happens as soon as a sperm has fertilized an egg. We start to get this cellular process where one cell divides into two, into four, into 8, into 16, etc. And eventually, you know, after a few months, you get some hands and some fingers and toes, or you might even get enough of an idea to be able to identify the gender. And then it keeps going, and you start to get an organ, and then you might get a nervous system, and you might get a vascular system, and then eventually you'll get some skeletal systems happening and some muscular systems happening, and then eventually you start to get, you know, a limbic system and all sorts of really cool things happening. And after 9 months of that gestation or that fermentation, these cells are now ready to be expelled from the environment that they are no longer able to be contained in. And now they are in the big wide world where they are subjected to further stress, and that helps them grow into babies and into you know, infants and adolescents and then adults. But ultimately, without our ego getting in the way, this process would happen regardless. It's the fact that we have these conscious minds that can interact with the world around us that dictate the process so heavily, and whether or not it's pleasurable or successful or not. So knowing what we know about cells and how they adapt to environments, let's look at stress. We need to identify stress. I'm going to move this laptop again really quick because I got everything happening in my face and it's killing me. Oh, it's a little better. Nice. Okay, so we've got stress. So we're going to define stress here by labeling it, or it's not even labeled as this. This is the definition. It's a pressure or tension exerted on a material object. So as I was saying before, all objects have this pressure or tension exerted on them, but only objects that aren't inert are able to adapt and change to become better suited to that environment. So for example, rocks don't necessarily grow, but they do attract other inert compounds and they do become bigger, but they're not necessarily adapting to their environment. They're a byproduct. But the other example of a child, as a child is born, it's had that 9 months of gestation in the womb where it's had this effect, this compounding effect. And now it's ready to be exposed to a greater environment or a greater stimulus. But for those first 9 months, it's very important that it's protected by the mother and the womb. So the mother and the womb create a contained environment for that cellular organism to create its own stress and adaptation cycle within. And it's nourished inside there and it's protected inside there from the elements. And then it's allowed out of that environment into a new one. And then it becomes integrated into this, circle of life, and it gets to go through that process anew with a little bit more independence. So cells, they're constantly being squeezed, and this comes back to the definition of pressure or tension. They literally are being constantly squeezed. There is constant force exerted upon us every single day. We just don't feel it because eventually it gets to a point where we can roll over, and then we can crawl on all fours, and then we can stand up on 2 legs, and then we can walk around with some assistance, and then we can walk around with no assistance, and then we run, then we jump, we grow up, we play sport. So the thing that's always compounding that pressure or that tension is gravity, essentially, on the cells within our body. But the bigger we get, the stronger we get, the less that effect has on us, and we're able to navigate our environment a little more. And this has a lot of these are the principles that have a lot of effect on the principles of performance when it comes to stuff like strength or power or speed or endurance. The better we can be at adapting to our environment, which is essentially gravity and the effects that it has on us, then the more ability we have to express this in a field-based sport, for example, or a throwing competition or a mixed martial arts competition. So cells are constantly being squeezed. We are constantly being squeezed. Our natural instinct on a cellular level is to divide and withstand this squeeze. So that's our natural instinct. But again, those instincts can be muddied when we get our ego involved, and the ego can have a tendency to label experiences as pleasurable or non-pleasurable, successful or failed. So if we continue down this little rabbit hole, whether we know it or not, this process happens across all aspects of our physiology, particularly psychological. And as I was saying, if we get our ego involved, particularly in a rehab situation, many people can label their rehab quite early based on how they feel rather than the progress that they're making. And you see this a lot, in rehab clinics or rehab situations where people are recovering from serious injury or strokes. It can be quite frustrating to remember how you used to function and then having to deal with how you now currently function. And every time I've ever injured myself, that's been the first port of call is I can no longer do the things that I've done because I'm not that person anymore based on the events that have led up to right now. And this is that Buddhist belief of anicca, where you can't sit in the past and think about all the things that you used to be able to do because you can't do those things anymore. You are now here. You can't necessarily look to the future because you don't quite know where you're going to go. You can only sort of steer the ship based on how the wind blows. So here we're looking at ways that we can start to induce this change in behavior from our clients, whether we're coaching them or treating them, whether they're in full training or they're in rehabilitation. We want to ensure they stay relatively grounded without getting too wishy-washy. We want to keep them relatively grounded where they are, acknowledging how far they've come, but always keeping their eyes on the prize. We want them moving towards something, and that's why we measure it. We want to measure the progress towards the goal, but we also want to be able to look back and acknowledge how far we've come. So having the ability to manage somebody psychologically, understanding how stress and its definition of pressure or tension are constantly on some of these people can help build some serious empathy when it comes to the coaching and the clinical side of things. And it also helps us when it comes to understanding adaptation as well. So our next point, stress is multifactorial and summative. The body does not discriminate between stresses. It is just all stress. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this later, but I want you to just consider in your mind things that have stressed you out, that have made you feel agitated and a little wound up. The body isn't able to discriminate between these different stresses. It all just becomes pressure or tension exerted on you, whether you are feeling it physiologically or psychologically. It's all just pressure. And when our clients walk in the door and they've had a pretty rough day, we don't want to be another compounding factor on that. So if we're rehabilitating someone, we don't want to be a compounding factor on that potentially psychological stress of already carrying an injury, and then having that acknowledgement or that empathy of understanding that some people can't stop from looking behind themselves and they wish that they were still there, or they're trying to go too far ahead and we have to hold them back. And then for people that are training, it's great to come in and get at it and lift heavy weight, but you've also got to understand that there's a physiological adaptation that needs to occur as per the first slide. And if we aren't respectful of that process, we might be pushing them too far, compounding too much on that stress, and that could lead to some undesired adaptations or effects, namely an injury. Think of it this way. So we're very sensory creatures. So we have our 6 senses. Some argue that we have 7. We have our 5 senses. We have our sight, taste, touch, smell, and hearing. And then, there's that magical 6th sense. But the senses that we have been refined and developed over many, many years. And we use those to navigate our environment. That's all we have. It's all we know. So when we get stuck in a situation that's challenging our norm, our status quo, or our homeostasis, it can be very hard to detach your emotion and your ego from that, because it's easy to remember how you were a day ago. It's hard to visualize what you could be like in a day, because that hasn't happened yet, based on what our senses are. So it's very challenging, but it's also very rewarding to be able to ensure that our clients are educated enough to understand about the differences between stress and adaptation, and that stress is good. It's not a bad word, but what we want to do as clinicians and coaches is gradually expose rather than stress. And we're about to touch on that very soon. Yo, hit me.
Do you have a recent example of de-stressing a client in either clinical or coaching situation that you could give us? Say a client walks in, they're obviously displaying a lot of stress. What would you do, and what did you do?
Sure, I can give you. I can give you one of each. So I can give you 2 examples, right? So one would be one of my clients who's an endurance athlete, and this client works split shifts, so night shift for a period and then day shift for a period. So that's an example of stress being summative, where they are challenged in managing their sleep and recovery. And then this person's very caring and very giving of their time, and they can get taken advantage of quite a lot by a lot of people in their life. So this person walked into the gym one day and was huffing and puffing and in a bit of a mood. And I pulled her up pretty quick and said, hey, let's go to the door, and I want you to pantomime putting this baggage down, because I don't want you bringing it into the gym. And then they huffed and puffed a little more. They went back, they pantomimed it like I asked them to. And then when they walked in, I said, look, it's all well and good to have a bad day, but I don't want you to bring it in here and take it out on me, because you're the first one to tell me when I'm taking it out on you. And I was able to make a connection emotionally with this person not by guilting them, but by manipulating their sense of right and wrong, and making them understand that what they were doing they weren't behaving in a way that was conducive to the environment. So I was able to help them empathize with me rather than have them dictate the environment, which wasn't very fair. Now, for the other one, for clinical, I had a client come in with chronic frozen shoulder, 18 months worth of chronic frozen shoulder. And he'd been bounced around a lot to a bunch of different clinicians. And this client presented with a lot of atypical breathing pattern, which, you know, is quite common in people that are very strung out. So what I did was got them to sit on the table after I'd done some functional and passive assessment and just do some breathing. And I saw that they couldn't breathe seated. So I took them into a lying position and we got some breathing there. And there was a lot of shaking, a lot of shuddering, and eventually they started to let go of some of this tension in the breathing pattern. And they had a little bit of an emotional release, which was very, you know, very new for me. I'd never been with someone in a clinical sense that had an emotional release. So they had, you know, a minute or two where they kind of just had a bit of a sob, and I was just sort of talking to them and helping them through that. And then when this person had calmed down, I asked them if I could look at their shoulder, and their passive range of motion had come back completely in their external rotation and a little bit internal rotation. But we didn't have any external rotation before they'd sat down. And then I asked the person to stand up and perform the functional test again, and they got so much better and they had no pain. So they weren't quite there at the range, but they had no pain. And all that was just from understanding that if they're walking in the door and I'm trying to compound on the stress that they've already got, I'm going to be kind of banging against a brick wall, and it's not going to be conducive to their function. So it's better off for me to try to attack this from a different point of view, and maybe not even attack it at all, but coax it and gently sort of nudge it along. Now, for some reason, Zoom has decided to tell me I need to upgrade again because I must be in the wrong account. So we're going to blitz through this last little bit, and then we're going to come back to asking some questions on outside of the recording. So what we just talked about, being stressed, multifactorial and summative, it's paramount to understand that we need to understand this difference when we are, or this principle when we are coaching and treating as clinicians, because we need to be ensuring that the clients are getting the most effective and efficient stimulus on the day, rather than us just compounding on their already pretty overloaded nervous system. Now let's look at exposure. So exposure is, well, we know stress is like a non-discriminatory summation of pressure or tension. So exposure, by definition, is the fact of experiencing something or being affected by it because of being in a particular situation or place. Now, the last part's very specific. Because of being in a particular place or situation, as coaches and clinicians, we dictate this particular situation or place. So we are able to navigate and specifically stimulate people with exposure, rather than just throwing them into the deep end and having them stressed, which is exactly what we're talking about here. We need to be deliberate and measured with our exposure to create a change in behavior. If you've watched that webinar already, you'll understand that behavior is measurable output. And if it's measurable, we can measure how far we've pushed it or how far we've lost it. Behavior change can and should be measured in order to quantify whether or not the change is functional. So functional, based on the other video as well, is completely context dependent. Could this person not do this thing before? Do they need to be able to do this thing? They are therefore dysfunctional. Let's restore function to this person. A lot of what I do is I base my function on relative norms. So shoulder function norms. If someone hasn't got these shoulder functions readily present, then I will do my best to restore those and see what it does to symptoms, rather than trying to get too specific too quickly with them. Now let's quickly go back here. Note the change in sensations, but do not simply chase the change in sensations, which is a conversation I've had with Lockie, who's in this mentorship group. So it's easy to be caught up in the change in sensations, but it's not enough to simply chase them, because if you chase them, then that ego can get in the way and think we're doing really well, until all of a sudden you hit a roadblock. But that roadblock might not be a halt in your progress. It could be just something that you need to bypass or go around. But some people run into this roadblock and think, oh, I've gone backwards. And then they will go backwards because they are too afraid to gradually expose themselves to these sensations. So we have to understand the difference there between exposure and stress. We're not trying to chase sensation. We are trying to chase measurable behavior or measurable outcome. Coaches and clinicians should encourage a graduated approach to exposure where possible. This can be done by the principle of progressive overload. So that is essentially intent coupled with intensity. I want you guys to remember this principle of progressive overload, intent coupled with intensity, because in the next few weeks, we're going to be talking a lot about that. So we're going to do a recap, and then we're going to do a quick little 5-minute break so you guys can have a digest, and then we're going to come back and hit some more. All right. The science of stress and adaptation can be categorized as very, very rapid cellular problem solving. The difference between stress and exposure can be the difference between steering closer to or further away from robust function. So remember, function is context specific, task specific. And then regardless of what we do, the body will adapt. Regardless of what we do, the body will adapt unless we kill them. If we kill them, then obviously that's bad. But also then we have proven that they have the inability to adapt to this stimulus. It's very rare that that happens, but consider somebody that's very overweight, very unfit, and their doctor has prescribed that they go and do a high intense interval training program in order to lose weight. And we don't take the precautions of screening their health, and then we prescribe them with this high intense interval training program. This happens all the time in this industry. And then this person goes and has a heart attack and dies. Who's to blame? There are so many people involved in this process, so many people involved in this process, but it's very important that the buck has to stop with someone. And I like to think that if this person's coming to see me, the buck stops with me. If I can do my job and remove as many variables as I can, not only does it cover my ass, but it covers the person that's in front of me as well, because I don't want them to leave and have my potentially biased opinion or my uneducated guess guiding their decision. So when someone comes to me, I'm able to navigate them in the right way based on how I think they need to be exposed to a certain stimulus, rather than, well, let's just stress them out in order to achieve the goal. And we will talk about things like, using stress and exposure and adaptation for performance in terms of, fat loss and how things like macronutrients are metabolized. But for today, let's just keep it pretty simple and understand that stress and adaptation go hand in hand. There is a difference between stress and exposure. We need to be that difference. Now, this last part, just because the body can and will adapt should not encourage us to tar all of our clients with the same brush, which is what I just said. Graduated exposure implies a level of individualization as each case presents itself. So you could have two very fit athletes in front of you, but one could be carrying some heart murmur or angina. You don't want to prescribe them both the same training regime because they both play the same sport and they're in the same team. Again, you want to graduate people with this exposure premise rather than just stressing them because you think they can handle it. So you can take it from the extreme end of this person's unhealthy and unfit, or this person seems to be a weapon. There is going to be an implied level of fitness when you meet people, or an implied level of preparedness and performance, but you should never go off that. You should always be objective, not subjective. All right, so let's get into this. We just talked about the difference between stress and exposure, and the way that stress and exposure have a cyclical nature or a cyclical effect with adaptation on a cellular level. So we can now use these tools to, I guess, have a little play with this concept with ourselves. So what I want you guys to do is, if you want to join in, you're more than welcome to find like a nice chill place just to lay down. Laying down is preferable. And what you'll need is your phone and a timer. If you're using your phone for the Zoom, it might not work. You can use a clock on the wall, but all you're going to need is a phone, and then put the timer on so that you can record some different times. So I'll give you guys 30 seconds or so to set that up, and then I'll run you through what we're going to do. Now, as you do that, this self-assessment can be used. Yeah, hit me what?
Do you need your phone, or can you just use like any stopwatch?
Any stopwatch will be fine, man. Don't stress, as long as you can time.
Yeah.
So we're going to use this tool as a means of making a more objective approach to stress tolerance. Let's call it stress tolerance before we dive too deep into it. So what we're going to do is, for the first step, we're going to take a nice deep inhale, exhale all that air, and then we're going to record when we get to the bottom of that exhale, we're going to record how long our nervous system is happy for us to just sit there with no oxygen in the system. So we're not making this a competition. We are just waiting for the first faint hint of that panic signal. So you'll breathe, exhale. We're not racing. We're just breathing out, holding that exhale, and then recording. And we want to see how long it takes until our nervous system sends that little tickle to the back of your sort of spine that says, whoa, I need to breathe. So let's try that. We're going to take a deep inhale. Record in your own time. And when everyone's done that, just let me know. And I'll edit this out of the video. Remember, this one isn't a competition.
Yep.
Good.
22 seconds.
Yeah, nice. This one isn't a competition. It's just seeing how long your nervous system is happy to exist.
I was the quickest I win, right?
Yeah, you win, man. You were first.
I got 19 seconds.
Oh, so we got someone that's beating Angus.
All right.
27.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, 24.
Cool. Owen, how'd you go? Owen's dead. He's died.
He's still going.
26.
Cool. All right. So what we've done there is we've taken away the oxygen. There's still oxygen in the system, but what we've done is started to build a level of carbon dioxide in the system. And this is a very good way. It's very, very rudimentary, but it's a very good objective way to measure somebody's CO2 tolerance, which is a marker of how well they are buffering stress. Because remember that at a cellular level, cells need oxygen to function. And the byproduct of oxygen, when it combines with carbon, is that it creates carbon dioxide. And when our system is particularly stressed and we're not able to breathe as effectively and as efficiently, we build up a lot of CO2, which changes the chemical acidity of our body, of our organism, and can create a very tense, very strung out nervous system. So this is a great way to just get a very quick diagnosis of whether or not somebody is maybe a little bit too stressed. There are no real norms with this at this stage. I don't want you guys to think, where should someone be sitting in order for them to be really good? Instead, if you want to make this a little experiment, record this in the morning, record this at night before you go to bed, and then just monitor it over a week. And if you're someone that likes to journal, then you'll be able to start dialing in on things that have maybe bugged you across the day that might affect your CO2 tolerance in the morning and at night. If you're in pain, do this and see if it's affecting your CO2 tolerance. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take an inhale, exhale, inhale, hold. So it's going to be a and now I'm holding my inhale for as long as I can. So this is one of those ones where I'd prefer if you were laying down, because you want to hold it until you feel that throb just behind your ears and your eyes, and then just hold it for a little bit more. You know, if you happen to black out, then at least you're on the ground, but not many people black out from holding their breath when they're doing this test. So you're going to inhale, exhale, hold for as long as you can. Let's just cap it at a minute. If you can get a minute, that's great. And then this is something that you can play with in your own time, but let's have a crack at that. So deep inhale, deep exhale, deep inhale.
So what RPE would you say are we holding our breath until?
Well, this is a max effort, but it's a max effort, but I don't want you guys to go over a minute for today, just so that we can keep this moving along.
Gotcha.
So I'll give you a minute. I mean, this is being edited out anyway, but I don't want to do too much editing. I'm pretty lazy. And I hate Mitchell Rowe, but it's okay. I can say that because I'm editing it out. So this is the one where we're trying our best to hold the tension, to withstand that that ache in the lungs as it creeps up the throat and into the back of the back of the head, the back of the neck. We want to try our best. It's not a competition against anyone else. It's just a competition against ourselves. And now what we're doing is we are identifying how well the body can utilize available oxygen in the system, because you've just flushed the oxygen into your system. So now how well can this oxygen catalyze with the carbon?
I got 20,
Nice job.
but then I stopped.
Same.
Good job.
Yeah, stop the
1 minute.
Hell yeah. So this is one of those ones where as your CO2 tolerance increases, your breath holds, both of these, will increase as well. This is just a cool little objective way that I use, like an objective tool that I use clinically to help gauge people how they're responding to treatment across sessions or across weeks, or how, if I'm using it in the gym, I might use this tool to gauge someone's readiness for a session. If I know that someone is consistently at a 30 to 40 second exhale breath hold, they come in and they're only at 15 or 20 seconds, we're going to spend the first 10 minutes doubling down on preparing their body to take on the exposure that I'm about to put them through, rather than just compounding on the stress they might already have. This is purely anecdotal. None of this is really set in stone, but there's some great work being done by a lot of awesome clinicians and coaches like Brian McKenzie, Dr. Andy Galpin, are two people that I would recommend going and having a look at that do a lot of this stuff. They investigate a lot of this breathing. And even Wim Hof, Wim Hof's been doing this for a really long time. So a lot of it's anecdotal, but the research is starting to catch up now with a lot of these pioneers that are saying, hey, the better you're able to navigate CO2 tolerance and scrub oxygen molecules through the system, the better you're going to get aerobically. Unfortunately, a lot of people are led by science, so they aren't bought into this concept of trial and error. But I've done a lot of this trial and error myself, and this has been something that's been very beneficial. Okay, let's move on. Let's have a look at our stress molecule, if I can get this thing to work. There we go. So the stress molecule, can anyone tell me what they think the stress molecule might be? Just shout it out.
Cortisone? Is that it?
Cortisol, yeah. Cortisol is a stress hormone.
What's the difference between cortisone and cortisol, though? Are they the same thing?
No, so cortisol is a natural hormone that's released by your pituitary gland. And we're going to talk about that in these slides. And cortisone is a steroid-based drug that's used to help manage inflammation. So it does a very similar job to cortisol. It's a corticosteroid, but its role is to specifically help manage inflammation, whereas cortisol has several other functions that go with it that help modulate stress and anxiety.
Cool.
Good question though.
Well, I don't know then.
So we're looking at a molecule. So hormone, not molecule. Sorry, molecule, not hormone. So the stress molecule is actually. So let's look at the principles before we dive in. Every part of our physiology is dependent on oxygen. Oxygen is a molecule, but it's not the stress molecule. Within this dependency, the triggering molecule to set off the oxidization that occurs within these functions must be present. So is this starting to give you guys a little hint as to what we might be looking at? Yeah, carbon dioxide. So the cells that we have in our body, we know this, they breathe as well. So this is called cellular respiration or oxidative phosphorylation. The reason we need the oxygen is so that the cells can use the molecule of oxygen to metabolize carbon within the body. So this is a crucial stage of cellular respiration where the oxygen will bond with the carbon and it will create carbon dioxide, and then that becomes very crucial in a lot of the cellular functions that happen from when we start to metabolize the carbon to removing the carbon from the system. But the next question for you guys is, where does the carbon come from that we have within the system? Does anyone know? So this is one of those cheeky ones where you know, it's like CO2. When I say it, you go, oh, of course. So the carbon that we get is from the macronutrients we metabolize. So you can get carbon from protein, from carbohydrates, from fat. Essentially, what we're just trying to do is break these molecules down into, break these compounds down into molecules that can interact with the cells that need to be respiring. And that happens through a variety of different processes and systems. And this is cellular respiration, or oxidative phosphorylation, which we'll do a dive in on a later module. But just understand that without the CO2 there, we can't have the cellular respiration. Important thing to note is that at the end of this cellular respiration process, we get oxygen, we get water, and we get energy. If there's no oxygen present in the system, and there's no carbon dioxide present in the system, then there's nothing for the stuff at the end of this process to bond to, this energy. There's a whole bunch of energy that's just sort of sitting there ready to go. And if there's nothing for that to bond to, so oxygen or carbon dioxide, then it doesn't get used and those cells die. So that's a very important principle to understand, is that if we don't have it, we will lose it. And later in this this specific slide, or these slides, we talk about efficiency and path of least resistance. This is something that we're going to be coming back to. It's very important to understand that if you don't use it, you lose it. A lot of what happens, so a great example of how carbon works within this system. Let me give you an example so that we can move on. We take a glucose chain. So it's typically like a 6 carbon chain that the body will then, so we've got 6 carbon, and then the body will break those 6 carbons into 2, 3 carbon chains. And this process of breaking creates energy. And that energy goes into creating more energy, essentially, and fueling this system. From here, we then take these 2, 3 carbon chains called pyruvate, and they get pushed into different, they get pushed into a different system called the, this is going to test my brain. They go into pyruvate. Okay, you can do this. They go into pyruvate oxidization, and then they go into the citric acid chain, citric acid cycle. So pyruvate oxidation, and then the citric acid cycle. Along the way, we're getting these breakdowns of these carbon compounds, and as they break down, we're getting offsets of carbon that need to go somewhere. And these carbon will bind to a free-floating oxygen molecule to create CO2. But in order for the oxygen to get there, it needs to be transported by CO2 as well. So not only are we using oxygen to scrub carbon and remove it from the system, but we're using existing carbon dioxide to help navigate oxygen molecules from the blood into the cell. And it's very important to understand this process, which is why there's a whole module dedicated to aerobic respiration. And obviously I need to brush up on it because I just forgot about the pyruvate oxidization. But essentially we've got this glucose chain that we break, and we break down. And at the end of this chain, we now have water and energy and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide needs to go somewhere. And if there's not enough oxygen in the system or carbon dioxide in the system, then there's not enough something to grab onto that carbon, and we can't create more carbon dioxide. So when people are in a stressed environment and they're breathing really fast and really shallow, they're not getting enough oxygen in, but more importantly, they're not getting enough carbon dioxide in the system either, because it's got to have that balance. So if we haven't got enough of the carbon dioxide and we haven't got enough of the oxygen, we can't take advantage of this cellular respiration across its entire continuum. And we're getting stuck in this, this lack of oxygen energy system where we're just relying on breaking glycogen to create energy. It's called glycolysis. So it's glycogen and then lysis, breaking. So the glycolysis is breaking these carbon chains down, and we're getting energy, a free floating energy from it, but we're not able to express that across the entire length of cellular respiration because we're not utilizing the oxygen at the end of that chain. So we're getting dependent on a specific energy system throughout the entire day. It's important to note before we keep going, and there's probably a slide on this, so I'm probably going a little bit ahead of myself, but it's important to note that glycolysis in itself happens without the presence of oxygen. It's an oxygen interdependent system, or independent system, I should say, not interdependent. It doesn't require oxygen. So what that means is it happens within its own cycle. So it creates energy from the process of breaking down carbon, and then it uses that energy to break more. So energy in a cycle is breaking, but what's happening at a very, very sort of micro level is we're losing net energy in this process because it's taking energy. So if all you're doing is breaking down carbon but not refueling, then you're eventually going to run out of energy because you're not accessing this cellular respiration across its full length. But I'm getting very far ahead of myself, so I don't want to go too ballpark too deep. Just understand that energy is created and destroyed evenly, but when we respire through the entire cellular respiration spectrum, we get a lot more energy at the end because we're left with a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of water, and some energy at the end, rather than just the initial stages of energy production, which just requires glycogen, so carbohydrate, a lot of that readily available within the muscle, and then we're just breaking that apart and then creating energy from the energy that is used to break. So that's not a very efficient system, but people that get stuck in this stress mode, this fight or flight, they end up using a lot of that energy system, but I'm confident we're going to come back to that anyway. So carbon dioxide, the stress molecule, it's an integral part of how oxygen is integrated at the cellular level, which we just talked about. And if you want to do a bit of research into how carbon dioxide is utilized at the cellular molecular level, look up the Bohr's effect, B-O-H-R-S effect. That will, I mean, it's a very deep dive. And if you guys need to do one-on-one with me, then we can. But that will give you an idea of how carbon dioxide is utilized within a cell to allow oxygen to pass between cells and blood cells. Very important. CO2 tolerance is just as important, therefore, to consider as a test such as VO2 max or other aerobic capacity tests, because of what we just talked about. If you are running a VO2 max test but not considering how someone is able to tolerate carbon dioxide as a separate test, you might be missing parts of this puzzle in terms of performance. Or like we just tested with our self-assessment, if you lay someone on the table and they can't breathe, and they couldn't breathe when they were standing, and then we go and try and apply some interventions to them and they're unable to breathe into these interventions, we could be creating more tension and more stress because they're not able to respond in a way that's easing tension. They're not getting enough oxygen in the system, they're maintaining that level of stress. So these are important factors to maintain, even though we took a really big side journey just before. Now we look at the stress hormone. So now this is what we were talking about before with cortisol. So highly demonized, greatly misunderstood. And I was guilty of this for a very long time. So cortisol is released, and this is important, primarily in conjunction with adrenaline in response to stress, which is, as we know, pressure or tension, or danger. Now, danger is an interesting one. Danger is perceived threat. If we remember what we talked about, stress is summative and non-discriminatory. And typically, danger is a little bit the same because of how psychology has an effect in fear. So we typically end up inheriting a lot of fears from people in our lives. I have a crippling fear of snakes and spiders from my dad and from my mum. My sister has a crippling fear of clowns from my mum. And I know a lot of people that have, fears of several other things that don't make sense to people that aren't them. But we have to empathize that danger is perceived. It's not necessarily always specific, it's quite relative. But then there are things like fire. Fire hurts. When you burn yourself, it hurts. So we don't want to be burned by fire. Everyone has a natural fear of fire. But stress, pressure or tension, non-discriminatory and compounding. Along with managing adrenals, it can also increase your body's metabolism of glucose. So let's take a little step back. what we just talked about before, where we metabolize glucose, we take our 6-carbon chain of glycogen, and then glycolysis is glycogen breaking. We break it, creates an energy, free-floating energy that is then used to break another glycogen and break another glycogen, break another glycogen. And in this way, we are going through something called glycolysis, or glycolytic anaerobic energy system. And this energy system in particular is only designed to be used between, science says between 10 and 2 minutes, but what we're seeing anecdotally is that people are using this all day, every day. Essentially, this system is designed to give you very fast energy, but because it's designed to be very fast, it's also designed to be taxed very fast. Now, when you are stressed and you are perceiving danger, or you are having that compounding effect of pressure or tension, and your cortisol levels rise, so too does your body's ability to metabolize glucose. It wants to metabolize the glucose because it feels threatened. We have upregulated the sympathetic nervous system. So now we are in overdrive, and we are creating more and more of this energy, and this energy needs to go somewhere. So it creates more and more energy until eventually your heart rate rises, your adrenaline rises, and your cortisol rises to meet it. You'll start to level off if you can identify that the threat is no longer there, or if you can maintain this level of stress across the day, like people with very sort of high threshold stressful jobs, then you've got a lot of neural feedback in the system, and your sympathetic nervous system is in overdrive. Now, this can have a lot of damage, or this can do a lot of damage in the long run, but there are so many compounding effects of stress that surprise a lot of people when we go through them. One of them is exercise. So exercise is actually a stress. And if it's just exercise you're doing without a sort of a training plan, and you haven't got someone that's prescribing your stimulus for you, then you could be compounding on that stress. Sleep deprivation is another one. Being undernourished, being dehydrated, or eating too much. Alcohol is another. Being chased by a lion is a great example of stress. More exercise, and then you've got people that are always running late for things. They have poor time management. Their kids are running amok all the time. They've got to pick them up from school. They're having a fight with their significant other. They haven't slept at all. Then they come and exercise, and you think, why are you here? Your nervous system is in such an oxygen deprived state, and because of that, you're unable to express that cellular respiration that we kind of spoke about before, but in a way that was very convoluted, and I apologize. So we have to understand that when cortisol levels, when they get too high, that the response in your body is it needs more oxygen because it's not getting enough. And then it starts to breathe faster, but quite shallow. And as a result, you start losing the ability to access carbon dioxide as well. And then that affects that cellular respiration process, which only compounds on the effect of your stress, because you're still not getting enough oxygen. So the brain starts to panic and says, we need to do more. And then it starts metabolizing more and more of this glucose that's in the body. What we want to do is learn how to
reduce cortisol levels.
Say again?
How do you reduce your cortisol levels then?
Great question.
If they're affecting that whole cycle.
Great question. So what you can do is breathe. And the self-assessment that we just did is a great way of picking up on someone's quote unquote cortisol levels, I guess. Without measuring it accurately, you can still get some sort of objective data. When you've sort of set a baseline, you can get objective information, say, well, Carly's here to train with me today. Carly tells me that she's had a shit day, hasn't slept, hasn't eaten food, had a fight with a significant other, kids are running amok. Hey, Carly, just sit in the corner for me and show me what your exhale hold is for today. And if Carly takes her ego out of the process, she should just sit there and say, start, exhale. Wow, okay, my breath really wants to catch up with me. I only got 5 seconds. And then I'm going to sit there and say, well, Carly, normally you sit around the 24 to 26 second mark, right? You'll say, yep. And then I'll say, great. So let's do some breathing. Let's put your legs up on the wall. Let's do some sort of parasympathetic breathing where we are lifting the legs above the heart and encouraging more oxygen into the system. So it could be slowing the breathing down or taking deeper breaths before we start to warm you up for your exercise, because it's going to have 2 for 1. One, it's going to oxidize the system. So if we get more oxygen in, we can use more of the carbon dioxide we're about to create when we exercise. 2, we're not compounding on the stress that you've just brought in with you. So now I'm able to expose rather than just stress. So it's a good question.
Yeah.
I typically do that at the start of a session if someone comes in pretty high strung, and I can normally pick it up. That comes from experience. But I always do it at the end of a session when someone finishes. I just ask them to chuck their legs up for 2 to 5 minutes and breathe, because I want them to bring themselves back down before they go out into the world and go and start stressing themselves. It seems like such a small thing, but it's such a vital tool for people to learn, because when you do, you can manage your own stress anytime if you've got a wall and 2 legs. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Good
Thanks for that.
question. No, you're welcome.
That's cool.
Now, when cortisol levels get too high and the breathing becomes super sharp and shallow, what I was saying is we lose the ability to utilize oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then more cortisol levels sort of start to skyrocket. And this can have a really adverse effect on people's psychology as well. So anxiety and depression, particularly in this modern era, are rampant right now because most people aren't using their bodies anymore. Number one, and they're understimulated. They're understimulated in terms of their work and what they do outside of work and hobbies, as well as autoimmune disease and digestive problems. Headaches, chronic headaches and chronic tension type headaches are through the roof at the moment. Like, people looking at screens all the time. Excuse me. Heart disease, people with sleep problems, sleep apnea or narcolepsy, or just an inability to fall asleep. Weight problems are out of control as well. Memory and concentration impairments are huge, especially with kids at school. So these are always things that are in my head when I'm training anyone. Doesn't matter, or I'm treating anyone. Doesn't matter if they're old or young. I want to know how they breathe, because if they can't breathe for me, then I can't treat them and I can't train them in an effective way that's gradually exposing them to new adaptation. Instead, I'll just be compounding on their stress. It's very important to manage that. When regulated, can control blood pressure and help manage or reduce inflammation. Poorly regulated cortisol will alter how your immune system responds and downregulate the parasympathetic nervous system. I'll tell you what, I've actually got a video. Let me find it. I will find this video and then I will show you what happens when somebody's, well, it's not somebody, it's an impala, which is a deer. So, and before anyone gets upset, the deer gets away, so it's fine, don't stress. But this jaguar, or it might be a leopard, catches a deer, and the deer is saved by some very cool monkeys. But watch what happens to the deer. Can you guys see the screen with the deer?
Yep.
Let me go full screen on this. So the jaguar's got the deer, and then the monkeys come along, and then they do what monkeys do and just throw their significant weight around. And it's all very cool, and people are sitting there going, wow, it's amazing. But watch what happens to the deer, right? The deer is laying there, and just watch the response of the nervous system. Eventually it comes. So you can see that the breathing, quite shallow. It's almost non-existent. It's like the deer has gone to sleep. Now the breathing starts to come back. And then the breathing will start to increase. All while this is happening, there are neurological drivers, cellular drivers that are dictating specific functions within the deer. There were specific functions that got shut down within this deer because specific hormones and specific cells got downregulated or completely trodden on. Now, this deer, I mean, depending on how deep you want to go, doesn't have, a job and a car loan and a home loan and a wife and kids or husband and kids. Instead, unlucky jaguar. Instead, it's just a deer doing what deers do. It goes around and it eats and it tries not to get eaten. But when, oh man, this is going to challenge me. But when we see it go through one of these crazy moments of, where's my screen share at? When we see it go through one of these crazy moments of adaptation, where it literally gave up, its nervous system gave up, and then its nervous system says, oh, by the way, you are still laying there and you're not doing anything, and nothing's trying to eat you. So I guess we'll start reprioritizing. Can you guys see the screen again, the slides again?
Yep.
Sweet. And now it says, well, now that you're not being eaten, we can reprioritize some systems and we can start getting some oxygen into the system. Now that stress is being compounded on in a big way because it has to pay the piper now that the time has come to sort of deal with the stress. As I was saying, at a car loan, a home loan, a fight with significant other, no sleep, no food, no water, and then a huge session on the bike or a huge session with the weights. And you'll see that in people, but they'll do everything they can to convince themselves and you that they're fine, and then they'll walk out of there. But they're not, and they're constantly and slowly, very gradually breaking down based on how they adapt to cortisol and how they manage carbon dioxide. So this is why it's so important understanding the difference between stress and exposure. All right, so cortisol is a stress hormone, and that responds in a non-discriminatory way to any stressor. So any stressor you get, cortisol will spike. So the stress versus exposure, we're almost at the end here. We discussed the difference between stress and exposure as tools for coaches and clinicians. Stress is non-specific and therefore hard to regulate. If you can't regulate it, you can't measure it. The flip side is true. So exposure is specific and therefore easy to regulate. If you can regulate it, you can measure it. Stress is multifactorial. Who's to say your stimulus isn't just adding to the pot? The flip side is true. Exposure shouldn't be multifactorial in that it's non-specific, right? You can still make it multifactorial and specific, but it must have the intent behind it rather than just trying to throw shit at the wall and hoping stuff will stick. For coaching, that's essentially what programming is. And for clinicians, that's why I encourage a lot of the clinicians that I work with to work with coaches so that they can, I guess, work in tandem and help offset each other's, shortfalls. Now, this one's important. Watch the client/patient. Their physiology can't help but give you clues as to whether or not they are tolerating a stimulus. All you have to do is watch an impala. The impala gave up and it stopped breathing. And then it came back to life because the nervous system and all the functions that underpins said, oh, our neck isn't being bitten by a jaguar anymore. So let's get this oxygen and start pushing it back into the cells. Let's get this cellular respiration happening again. Let's get this oxidative phosphorylation again. My God, I can't even speak right now. Let's get a cellular respiration happening again so that we can start doing impala things. People do the same, but they can't help but show you whether or not they're tolerating a stimulus. So for clinicians, stuff like facial wincing, you can even see this when people are lifting or if they're in the middle of a particularly hard, exercise or workout. Breath holding is a really important one. Breath holding or bracing is a sign that you are not able to adapt to the environment that you're in and you're trying to hold as much oxygen as you can. There's a difference between bracing against load and tension or bracing against pain or stress. You got gasping. So gasping is an interesting one where you'll touch something that's quite sore or sensitive and they'll gasp and they'll maybe even jump. Forced or restricted exhales. So that's when people grit their teeth and breathe out really, really hard and firm and they're trying to tough it out. So this is another example where we're not getting clean, easy access to oxygen and carbon dioxide. We're making their nervous system work really hard. Withdrawing, so people that withdraw into a bed when you're trying to touch them, and then involuntary spasms as well. This can happen when people are exercising as well. This happens under load a lot, and you can see this as bar path deviation.
It just mirrors his voice gone.
Cam, we can't hear you.
Your voice is gone, Cam.
Maybe Cam's gone.
Can you guys hear him yet?
Your nervous system is incapable
Yeah,
of owning it. What happened? Oh, I must have got a phone call. Did you lose me for a bit?
Yep, you're back now.
I must have got a phone call. Apologies.
About 90 seconds worth.
Oh, no. Might have to go back over it again. So this is the general rule. If you don't own it, you're just borrowing it. And if you're just borrowing it, the interest will bite you in the ass. If you are performing mobility or some sort of exercise and it's a low threshold exercise and you're unable to breathe through it, then consider that a signal from the nervous system that somebody isn't tolerating the stress.